Okay, so like any good scientist, you want to try to do something in the lab to simulate and test your theory. And so, what this gentleman named Urey and Miller, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, in the 1950s, that far back, decided to try to simulate the early environment, those things that we would think would have been the conditions of the earth back before life existed on the planet. So they thought, well, there'd be a lot of volcanoes, like those volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean, those black smokers that you saw on the previous page. The variations, and we've done a lot of different variations of this experiment, changing the gases, changing the amount of energy, and et cetera. And a lot of different versions of this experiment produce these organic molecules, right? Remember, organic molecules. A lot of people think of or the word organic, and you're going to hear it over and over again in your supermarket, for instance, organic, as being from life, right? Something that's formed from life. Well, organic actually means a carbon based, right? So something that has carbon based. So these molecules usually are those that we've discussed in class. We're talking about amino acids, carbohydrates. By this point, everybody should be able to list all four of them, since we've said it over and over again for almost a year now. But amino acids, carbohydrates, and by the way, amino acids, we'd also have to say proteins, right? The polymers of the monomers. But amino acids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, right? And that goes for RNA and DNA, right? And lipids. And it turns out that when you look at the natural world in these primordial states, we find a lot of these organic molecules forming without the need of life, without there being a living organism producing them. So we know that these at least the rudimentary, the monomers, right, of these three, and these things called the small lipids, or the base units of these, the smaller versions of these, the less complicated versions, easily form under these conditions. In fact, we've even found them, as mentioned earlier, in deep space. So we've seen these things form without the need of life being present. We've been able to make all 20 amino acids, and we've noticed that about 4% of the carbon, 4%, that seems like not so much, right? 4%. 4% of the carbon from methane, right, has been converted to amino acids. So it doesn't seem like a lot, but if you have a lot of methane, that's a lot of amino acids. And when we look at iron pyrite as a possible place or stabilizing surface area, because the iron pyrite is very common on the Earth's surface, we can find that perhaps this was the surface upon which a lot of these molecules were made. So today we think that the atmosphere was probably made of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, right? But what's interesting, and something you may not have noticed right away if you just looked at those elements without thinking about anything else, I hope you, or maybe you did notice, but there's no oxygen gas listed here. That's because we don't think there was a lot of oxygen on the planet. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that there was not free oxygen in the atmosphere of the Earth before life began. In fact, we think that those little green single-celled organisms called cyanobacteria that we looked at the earliest forms, some of the earliest forms of life, We think they changed the atmosphere of the planet that allowed for life as we know it to exist. It's a mechanism by which we think the atmosphere was changed by life, almost like the fact that we're changing the atmosphere of our planet now with our actions. The cyanobacteria changed the atmosphere of the planet billions of years ago. So let's take a look at the experiment that Urey and Miller made. So they took and they had an electrical arc being created between these two, the positive and negative end. This is the energy, source of energy. Now, they figured that this would take the place of lightning in nature. Since we know primordial Earth was very volcanically active, volcanoes often bring down lightning. When there's a volcanic activity, often lightning is associated with it. So we're pretty sure lightning was happening back before life existed on the planet. These are the gases they thought were in the air at the time. We think it's probably closer to this, right? These are what are released by modern volcanoes. Urey and Miller assumed this: ammonia, hydrogen, steam, and methane. And again, many versions of this experiment have been done where they changed these gases, and still these organic molecules, these organic based molecules, were formed. So it's all one continuous tube. This is all made of glass. They have a condenser, and what happens here is this cold water runs through a pipe to this connector. This space is outside of this space. So this is a glass tube inside a glass tube right here. So that the cold water surrounds this area, cooling it off. So here it's heated, and here it's cooled off. Now, as we've discussed, when you cool a gas, it turns into a liquid, depending on its condensation point. So you cool off the gas inside this tube here by surrounding it with cold water. As the liquid drips down to the tube, it gets stuck in this U-tube, and then you can open up this valve and take a sample out, continuously sample out whatever you like from this U-tube. Now, of course, this is a heater, so it heats up water to simulate the boiling primordial oceans, right? Theoretically, the Earth was very hot after it was formed. Remember, we think it was formed by gases condensing, very, very hot, thick, because of the gravitational pull of the mass of all those gases spinning in space. Collisions between the moon and the Earth caused even more volcanic activity, etc., etc. So you have a lot of geologic activity. So a lot of heat, a lot of volcanoes, a lot of lava and magma. So the heat was an essential part of that. And that puts water into the air, right? H2O gas into the air. Then here, through this particular tube, they were able to introduce, right, put into this mixture whatever gases, methane, ammonia, whatever concentration of each of these they wanted to, or release some of that pressure by relieving some of that pressure by removing some of the gas. And they were able to keep this circulation going. And what they found is about 4% of the carbon from the methane was turned into these basic organic molecules, specifically amino acids. Well, where'd the cooling come from in nature? Well, we think that the early Earth had a lot of cool areas. It was probably frozen with some boiling hot spots like the volcanic vents that you saw earlier. And the molecules were able to be stabilized by that and by surface areas like iron pyrite. And these organic molecules were able to sit and wait until something happened. All right, so in the Miller-Urey experiment, so let's outline what I just said. So the Miller-Urey experiment simulated life, the world before life. Existed on the planet. And remember those 5 steps, those 5 logical steps that scientists have been thinking had to have happened before life was made. Whether you believe that God created it or not is not the point here, right? It's what is the mechanism for life to have been made. And so logically what we think is that you had to have those 5 steps occur first because we know how life works, right? We know a cell needs lipids. We know proteins need to be made. We know genetic information has to be kept in order for things to be passed on. All those characteristics of life. We know that these organic molecules had to exist before the cell. So how did these organic molecules come to be? Well, that's what this experiment was designed to simulate. And so they added the gases that they felt existed 3.5 or 4, 3, let's say 3.5 billion years ago. Well, how would they know that? How would they know what gases existed 3.5 billion years ago? Well, they made some assumptions, yes, some logical assumptions, right? So let's make sure we understand that. They also were. They're also their assumptions are based on. So it's not just a crazy guess. It's a scientific guess, which means we base it on evidence. So there's geologic evidence. What would some of that geologic evidence be? That would be the chemistry of the rock. We know what this stuff reacts with. We know how it reacts. We know what these things can produce when combined with various other substances. And because of all that, we can make some pretty good assumptions as to what mixes with what and what it would produce. So if we know, for instance, that there's iron if we know that there's iron in the rock and the iron is black and it's not rusted, then we're kind of going to go ahead and assume that there wasn't any oxygen, because we know that when oxygen is present in the presence of iron, iron rusts. And we know that because we see it all the time. There's no reason to assume that in the 3.5 billion years ago that iron wouldn't rust if there was oxygen around. So we can make all those kinds of assumptions with all kinds of different substances, like iron pyrite, right? We can see the iron pyrite that was been trapped in the Earth's crust. We've dug cores. We can based on the chemistry of rock, based on core sampling, right? Obviously, we've dug deep holes into the crust, and we've looked at the rocks that are deep in the Earth's crust, theoretically not really exposed to the Earth's atmosphere, assuming that it wasn't turned over, right? It's not, assuming that no earthquake has turned it over, and we can assume that because when we look at the Earth's crust, there are these things called layers. It's kind of how we date rocks and how we date fossils, and etc. And if we see as part of the layer that there's a crack and the layers don't line up, right? So if the layers don't line up, so when we look at this material might be, I don't know, this material might be one sort of stuff, let's call it marble, and that marble layer continues here, where this granite layer here, right, is continuous. Then over here we find shale, It wouldn't be shale, but let's just go ahead and say shale. And then here's shale. Then there was something happened. There was a break in the layers. So we can tell by the layers and their relative position to each other whether they've been overturned, right? So you can get overturning. You can get even large pieces of land that have been reversed, even flipped over, and went through a geologic explosion, like a big volcanic eruption that blew off a piece of land, and we could actually see if there was layers that look like this. You might even find a break and have the reverse happen, right? Where there seems to be the layers might look like this. Just the whole thing's been flipped. Now you and I would walk around on the surface of the earth, and all we would see from the surface is, as we stand here, would be right here looking up, we'd see a cliff. So there's a cliff. And maybe there's trees growing here, all right, and bushes. And maybe a river runs through here like this, over here, another cliff. So we really wouldn't see all these layers until you start digging through the layers and see that this is marble, and this is marble, and this is granite, and that's granite, and you can see that the granites match up. You might even find similar fossils in this layer and this layer, and then this could be some other layer of rock here. So we can tell by that maybe something happened. Maybe an ancient volcanic eruption kicked this off, it flipped over and landed back down again. And that flipping, that break, you can actually see it. You can identify it. If you've ever been near, walked a river path, you would see the layers of rock that are underneath the trees and the bushes and the things that life exists on the planet's surface today. So in the middle of the forest, you might see, all you would see is a cliff, and you'd be walking on ground, but the layers of rock underneath you would tell a story. And by digging core samples, scientists can look at the geology, the different rocks that make up that surface, that land, and look at the chemistry of that rock to try to figure out what changes have happened over time. And so we can make some pretty good guesses of what the atmosphere was like because of things like, well, the iron didn't rust. Well, the pyrite didn't rust. So it's likely there was not a lot of oxygen. And so you can make these kinds of deductions based on our geologic evidence. So now let's try to answer these questions. In the Urey Miller experiment simulating the conditions of primeval Earth, identify parts of the apparatus equivalent to below. The primeval atmosphere would be part of what here in this experimental outline? Lightning would be simulated by what here? The ocean would be, the primeval hot ocean would be simulated by what part here? And the volcanic heat would be simulated by what here? What organic molecules were created in this experiment? Well, again, you can read the answers here. Why do you think Miller-Urey experiment is not an accurate model of what happened in primeval Earth? As we know, it's not accuracy. Yeah, there's really a lot of places where this is not accurate. So think about it. I made somewhat. We made somewhat. And are these accurate? Well, we're talking about 3.5 billion years ago. Were they really trying to have an accurate and a super accurate model? No, their objective was to do what? to try to see if they could produce these things, if it was possible to produce these organic molecules from stuff that was inorganic, right? So stuff that was not or did not have a lot of carbon chains. Could you form these larger, more complicated carbon molecules from these simpler molecules? And the answer was yes, without the use of life, just by setting up pieces that we know probably existed 3.5 years ago. The atmosphere, the ocean, the lightning, the volcanic heat. What changes in the experiment could help it to better fit our understanding of the Earth's primordial conditions? So what might we be able to change in this experiment that might help us make it more like those primary conditions? So I would ask you to think about things like pressure, things like I don't know, temperature. Could you add any solids? So far you in the experiment you saw liquids and gases. Are there any solids that could be added that might help it be more accurate or be a better simulator? What was present back then that is not part of this experiment, right? You have lightning, you have gas, you have water, you have a condenser that cools it off. Well, what else is present? I want to tell you, but I'd rather you think about it and see if you can figure it out. There's something really that you look up in the sky and see all the time. Every day you see it that's not listed here. It's not part of this experiment. All right.